Welcome back to Tina Romance Library, where powerful alphas fall hard, and the women they underestimate change everything. Every story here is complete, immersive, and emotion-driven. No cliffhangers, no rushed endings, just full romances you can sink into. Today's story? She hid her heat for years with terrible-tasting herbs just to survive until it broke in front of the Alpha King, who shocked everyone by kneeling instead of claiming her. What follows is a powerful, tender romance where respect ignites change, traditions crumble, and she learns that hiding was exhausting, and the herbs were definitely the worst part. So if you love possessive alphas, strong heroines who don't beg, slow burn tension, and emotional payoffs, you're in the right place. I need you to join the pack right now by subscribing. Leave a like if you enjoy immersive romance. And settle in, because once the story begins, we don't stop until the ending. Now, let's get into it. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the first thing you need to understand. The Palace Records Hall wasn't a place for someone like me, a low-ranking clerk with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of chewing my bottom lip when I thought no one was watching. I'd spent 3 years filing documents in the shadows, perfecting the art of being invisible. In a palace full of alphas, betas, and wolves bred for power, invisibility wasn't just a skill. It was survival. The day it happened, I remember the cold. The records hall was always cold. Stone walls that seemed to breathe winter no matter the season, and I'd wrapped my worn cardigan tighter around myself as I reached for a ledger on the highest shelf. My fingers had just brushed the leather spine when I felt it a flutter low in my belly, so faint I almost dismissed it as hunger. I hadn't eaten since dawn. The palace didn't exactly prioritize meal breaks for the help, but then it came again. Stronger this time. A wave of heat that started in my core and rippled outward like someone had lit a match beneath my skin. No, not here. Not now. My breath caught in my throat as realization crashed over me with the force of a tidal wave. This couldn't be happening. I was 23 years old and I'd never had a heat. Not once. I'd assumed I was broken, defective, one of those rare omegas whose biology never quite kicked in. I'd been grateful for it, honestly. It meant I could work. It meant I could stay beneath notice. It meant I was safe. The ledger slipped from my trembling fingers and hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the silent hall like a gunshot. The heat intensified, spreading through my limbs until my knees buckled. I grabbed the shelf to steady myself, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wood. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, and that's when the scent started to leak out, sweet and desperate and utterly unmistakable. The scent of an omega in heat, raw and potent enough to drift through closed doors and down corridors, calling to every alpha within range like a biological siren. Panic clawed at my chest. I needed to move. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't cooperate, and the room was starting to spin. And oh God, the scent was getting stronger. I pressed my palms against my face, as if I could somehow push it back inside, trap it beneath my skin where it belonged. Shame burned hotter than the heat itself. This was my nightmare exposure. Vulnerability. Becoming exactly the kind of liability that god omegas like me discarded, or claimed by the first alpha, cruel enough to want a toy. I didn't hear him enter. One moment I was alone, drowning in my own terror, and the next I felt a presence so massive and commanding it changed the very air pressure in the room. The kind of power that made your hindbrain scream predator even before your conscious mind caught up. The Alpha King. He smelled it before I could hide. Before I could run, before I could do anything but stand there, frozen and exposed, with my broken biology betraying me in the worst possible way. His scent hit me like a physical force, pine and smoke, and something wild and ancient that made my wolf whimper and curl in on itself. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The heat surged in response to his presence, my body recognizing something my mind refused to accept. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at him, it would be real. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. could feel the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck like a brand. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I knew with every instinct I possessed that he was deciding what to do with me. Terror is a strange thing. It doesn't always make you scream or run. Sometimes it roots you to the spot, turns your bones to lead and your voice to sand. I waited for the inevitable, for rough hands and cruel laughter and the end of whatever fragile peace I'd managed to build in this place. Alphas didn't kneel for omegas in heat. They took. That was the way of things. His shadow fell across me then, long and dark and inescapable. I squeezed my eyes shut, and then the Alpha King knelt. I was 7 years old the first time I understood what it meant to be Omega. Her name was Clara. She lived 3 houses down from ours in the lower quarter, where the streets were narrow and the houses leaned against each other like exhausted workers at the end of a shift. Clara was 16, beautiful in that fragile way that made the older women shake their heads and whisper prayers they didn't think we children could hear. She had dark hair that caught the light like oil slicks, and a smile that could make even the grumpiest shopkeeper slip her an extra apple. I adored her. The way little girls adore older girls who seem to contain some secret knowledge of how to exist in the world without apology. Then her heat came. I remember my mother grabbing my wrist so hard it left bruises, yanking me away from our front window where I'd been watching the procession. Because that's what they called it, a procession, like it was something holy. The drums had started at dawn, and by midday, half the lower quarter had gathered in the street outside Clara's house, faces painted with ceremonial marks, voices raised in songs that were supposed to be celebratory. But I heard the screaming underneath. It came from inside Clara's house, high and desperate and animal. The kind of sound that bypasses your ears and goes straight to some primal part of your brain that knows when something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. My mother tried to pull me away, but I'd planted my feet, staring at that closed door while the crowd cheered and the drums pounded. And Clara screamed herself hoarse behind walls that might as well have been made of paper for all the protection they offered. "Mama, why is she screaming?" My mother's face had gone pale. "She's being blessed by the moon goddess." "It doesn't sound like a blessing." Her grip tightened. "We don't question tradition, little one." But I was questioning it. Every instinct I had was questioning it. Because 3 alphas had entered that house, their faces grim with purpose, and only one would emerge as Clara's mate. The elders called it sacred the claiming ritual, where an Omega's first heat drew worthy alphas to compete for the right to bond. They said it was how the moon goddess chose matches, that the strongest alpha would win, and the Omega would be honored. I called it a warning. Clara stopped screaming after the 2nd hour. The silence was somehow worse. When they finally brought her out, she was wrapped in ceremonial cloth, carried in the arms of an alpha I'd never seen before. A man twice her age, with scars on his knuckles and eyes that looked through her like she was already his possession. The crowd cheered. My mother cried tears she claimed were joyful. Clara's eyes were empty. I learned 3 things that day. First, that tradition was just a prettier word for ownership. Second, that the people who loved you would hand you over to it anyway, because that's what good Omegas did. They submitted. They accepted. They were grateful for the honor of being claimed. And third, that I would do anything, absolutely anything, to make sure I never ended up like Clara. The first time I stole suppression herbs, I was 12 years old. Old Marta sold them from the back of her apothecary shop, hidden behind jars of legitimate remedies because even she knew what she was doing, skirted the edges of acceptable. Suppression wasn't illegal, exactly, but it was frowned upon, unnatural, going against the moon goddess's design. But Marta had been an Omega once, and she'd seen enough Claras to know that sometimes going against design was the only way to survive. "You sure about this, little rabbit?" She'd peered at me over spectacles held together with wire, her gnarled fingers already reaching for the clay jar on the highest shelf. "Once you start, you can't stop easy. Your body will fight you." "I'm sure." She'd measured out a month's supply in a small cloth pouch, along with instructions I'd memorized before I'd even left her shop. Brew it with hot water twice daily. Drink it all, even when it makes you gag. Don't skip doses. Don't tell anyone. The herbs tasted like regret, and bad decisions bitter and oily with an aftertaste that lingered for hours, coating my tongue with something that might have been mint if mint had died angry. I gagged through the first cup, nearly vomited through the second. By the third day, I'd learned to hold my breath and swallow fast, chasing it with honey water that only partially masked the horror. But they kept me alive. Month after month, year after year, I brewed those herbs in secret, hiding the pouch in the hollowed-out book I kept under my mattress. The ritual became as natural as breathing wake before dawn. Boil water, choke down the mixture before anyone in the house stirred. My mother never questioned why I never went into heat. I think she was relieved. One less daughter to worry about, one less mouth to negotiate a way to some alpha's household. The herbs turned my biology into a locked door. They muted the parts of me that were supposed to bloom and call and submit. They made me invisible in all the ways that mattered in a world that valued omegas primarily for their ability to be claimed. And for 11 years it worked. I'd gotten a job at the palace through sheer persistence and acceptable penmanship. They needed clerks, and I needed to be somewhere no one asked questions. The records hall became my sanctuary, dust and silence and leather-bound ledgers that didn't care what I was. I'd built a life in the margins, and I'd convinced myself I was safe, until the morning I reached for that ledger and felt my careful fortress crumble beneath me like sand. The palace had a rhythm, and I'd learned to move between its beats like a ghost slipping through walls. 5 years I'd worked in those stone corridors. 5 years of arriving before dawn when the halls were still empty, and the alphas were either sleeping off last night's hunt or training in the yards far enough away that I couldn't smell the testosterone and dominance rolling off them in waves. 5 years of keeping my head down, my scent muted, my presence so unremarkable that most of the palace staff couldn't have picked me out of a lineup. I'd made an art form of disappearing. The records hall was perfect for it. 3 floors below the main palace, tucked away in a corner that saw maybe 5 visitors a week if we were busy. Mostly it was me and the dust and the endless rows of shelves holding centuries of documentation that nobody cared about until they suddenly, desperately needed a land deed from 1847 or a birth record for some minor noble's great-grandfather. The work was tedious cataloging, filing, repairing water-damaged pages with careful fingers and specialized paste. But tedious meant solitary, and solitary meant safe. I'd learned the palace's blind spots the way some people learn dance steps. I knew which staircases the alphas never used because they were too narrow for their egos. I knew which corridors emptied out during shift changes, giving me exactly 7 minutes to move from the records hall to the kitchens and back. I knew the servants' routes, the guards' rotations, the times when the Alpha King held court and every dominant wolf in the building would be clustered in the throne room, leaving the rest of the palace blessedly empty. I'd mapped my own invisible kingdom within their walls. The other Omegas thought I was strange. I'd catch them whispering sometimes, in the brief moments when our paths crossed in the servants' quarters or the communal washrooms. They couldn't understand why I didn't try to catch an alpha's eye, why I dressed in shapeless gray dresses that hid every curve, why I scraped my hair back so severely it gave me headaches. They were all hoping for advancement through strategic mating a beta if they were unlucky, an alpha if the moon goddess smiled on them, a way out of servitude and into a household of their own, even if it meant belonging to someone else. I'd learned from Clara that belonging to someone else was just a gentler word for being owned. So I drank my herbs and kept my head down and counted days like a prisoner scratching marks into a cell wall. But the body keeps score, even when you're trying to cheat the game. Year 3 was when I first noticed the tremors. Just small things at first, my hands shaking when I tried to thread a needle, a cup of tea rattling against the saucer when I lifted it. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, too much time hunched over ledgers in bad light. The herbs tasted worse than usual that year, and I had to force them down with increasingly creative combinations of honey and mint and anything that might mask the bitterness that seemed to intensify with every passing month. Year 4 brought the headaches, blinding things that would strike without warning, turning my vision into a kaleidoscope of fractured light and sending me stumbling to dark corners to wait them out. I started keeping a bucket in the records hall, because sometimes the pain made me vomit, and I couldn't risk being seen weak and vulnerable in the shared washrooms. Year 5 this year, my body started forgetting how to regulate temperature. Some days I'd be shivering under 3 layers despite the mild weather. Other days I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my sheets soaked through, my wolf whimpering somewhere deep in my chest, like she was trying to claw her way out of a cage I'd built from desperation and ground-up herbs. Old Marta had warned me, that first day when I was 12 and stupid and certain I knew better than my own biology. "Your body will fight you," she'd said. She hadn't mentioned that eventually, my body might win. I wasn't living during those 5 years. Let's be honest about that. I was hiding successfully, which isn't the same thing at all. Living implies joy, growth, moments of spontaneous laughter, or unexpected connection. Living implies a future you're building toward, dreams you whisper to yourself in the dark, plans that extend beyond just making it through another day without being noticed. I had none of that. What I had was a routine so precise it might as well have been carved into stone. Wake at 4:30, brew the herbs, choke them down, wash, dress, leave my tiny room in the servants' wing before anyone else stirred, navigate the empty corridors to the records hall, work in silence until the lunch bell, when I'd eat whatever plain food I'd wrapped in cloth the night before, work until the evening bell, navigate back through the blind spots, lock myself in my room, sleep, repeat. The other servants had lives. They had friends, lovers, arguments over card games and gossip about which guard was sweetest on which kitchen maid. They had small rebellions, stolen wine, midnight trysts, elaborate schemes to get out of the worst chores. They complained about the work but found moments of lightness in the cracks. I had my herbs and my ledgers and my carefully maintained invisibility. Sometimes, late at night when the palace finally quieted, and I was alone with my thoughts and the persistent ache in my bones, I'd wonder what Clara was doing, whether she'd learned to love the alpha who'd claimed her, or whether she'd just learned to endure, whether her eyes had ever found their light again, or whether she'd settled into that emptiness like a comfortable dress you wear because it's easier than finding something that actually fits. I'd wonder if the life I'd built, this half-life of hiding and herbs and counting days, was really any better than hers. But then morning would come, and I'd brew my herbs and swallow them down, and the question would fade beneath the more immediate need to survive another day without being seen. I'd gotten good at not being seen, right up until the moment my body betrayed me in a cold stone hall, and the most powerful alpha in the kingdom caught my scent, and everything I'd built came crashing down around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. The ledger fell, and with it, any illusion of control I'd spent 5 years constructing. The heat didn't creep up on me. It didn't give me warning signs or gentle nudges that I could have ignored or pushed through. It detonated in my body like something that had been compressed too long, held back by sheer force of will and botanical chemistry, until the pressure became unsustainable and everything just broke. One moment I was reaching for that ledger, my mind on land deeds from the Eastern Territories, and the next I was on fire from the inside out. It started in my core, a sensation so intense it bordered on pain, like someone had lit a match to every nerve ending below my rib cage, and the flames were spreading outward in waves I couldn't control. My hand flew to my stomach, fingers pressing hard against the fabric of my dress as if I could somehow push it back, contain it, force it back down into whatever locked box it had escaped from. But there was no containing this. The heat rolled through me in pulses that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. I grabbed for the shelf, my fingers closing around wood that suddenly felt miles away even though I could see it right in front of me. Sweat broke out across my forehead, my upper lip, the back of my neck. My carefully pinned hair was already coming loose, damp tendrils sticking to my skin. And then came the scent. Oh God, the scent. I could smell myself, which should have been impossible, but wasn't sweet and desperate and thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue. It was pouring off me in waves, flooding the records hall with pheromones so potent they made my own wolf stir and whimper in confusion. 11 years of suppression hadn't just delayed my heat. It had concentrated it, compressed it into something so powerful that when it finally broke free, it was like every heat I'd ever denied myself was hitting at once. My body was calling for an alpha with a voice I'd spent over a decade trying to silence. Panic clawed up my throat, sharp and metallic. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not in the palace where alphas prowled the corridors like apex predators waiting for weakness to reveal itself. I'd been so careful. The herbs had never failed me before. Even when my body had started fighting back with tremors and headaches and temperature swings, the herbs had held the line. What had changed? But I knew. Even as the question formed, my body had been weakening for months. The constant suppression had been eating away at me from the inside, and this morning I'd been so exhausted, so ground down by another sleepless night of bone-deep aches, that I'd halved my dose. Just this once, I'd told myself, just to see if I could function without feeling like I was trying to digest poison. That single moment of weakness had torn open a door I'd kept locked for 11 years. Another wave hit, stronger than the last, and my legs gave out completely. I went down hard, my knees cracking against the stone floor with an impact I barely felt through the inferno consuming me. The ledger I'd been reaching for lay open beside me, its pages fluttering in a draft I couldn't feel. And somewhere in the rational part of my brain that was still functioning, I thought about how ridiculous this was brought down by a book about land boundaries while my biology staged a coup. The rational part was getting smaller by the second. Heat, real heat, not the kind I'd read about in whispered conversations or medical texts, was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't romantic or mystical or blessed by the moon goddess. It was violence. It was your body hijacking your mind and demanding something you'd sworn you'd never give. It was need so visceral it bordered on agony, an ache that started deep in your core and spread until every inch of your skin felt too tight and too hot and too sensitive. I pressed my palms against the cold stone floor, trying to ground myself in something real, something that wasn't the pheromone-saturated air, or the way my wolf was suddenly very present and very interested in finding an alpha to make this stop. No, I wouldn't. I'd rather die on this floor than let this break me. But my body didn't care what I'd rather do. It was operating on instinct older than civilization, older than pack law, older than every carefully constructed social structure that had convinced me I could opt out of this. My wolf was rising, pushing against my consciousness like she'd been buried alive and had finally found a crack in the earth to claw through. I tried to stand, made it maybe 6 inches off the ground before another wave slammed into me and I collapsed again, my cheek pressed against stone, my breath coming in short gasps that didn't seem to bring enough oxygen. The room was spinning. Or maybe I was spinning. It was getting hard to tell the difference between my body and the space it occupied. The scent was everywhere now, saturating the air, seeping into the books, probably drifting up through the ventilation shafts into the palace proper where any alpha with a working nose would smell it and know exactly what it meant. Fresh omega in heat, unclaimed, vulnerable. The thought should have terrified me. It did terrify me. But there was another feeling underneath the terror, something my rational mind recoiled from but my traitorous body leaned into anticipation. Want. The horrible, undeniable truth that part of me was calling for this, had always been calling for this, and no amount of herbs or hiding or carefully constructed invisibility had ever truly silenced it. I'd just been delaying the inevitable. My fingers curled against the stone, nails scraping uselessly, as another pulse of heat rolled through me. This one brought nausea with it, my stomach clenching as I dry-heaved, my body rejecting itself. I thought about Clara, about her empty eyes and the way she'd stopped screaming once they'd broken something fundamental inside her. I thought, this is how my life ends, not with dignity or choice or any of the control I'd fought so hard to maintain. But here, collapsed on cold stone in an empty records hall, my body betraying every promise I'd made to myself about staying free. I didn't hear the door open. Didn't hear footsteps approaching through the pheromone fog and the roar of blood in my ears, and my wolf's desperate keening for something I'd sworn we'd never need. I just felt the temperature in the room drop about 20 degrees. felt the weight of a presence so massive it made the air itself feel heavier. Felt my wolf go absolutely still, not in fear, but in recognition of something that made even blind instinct pause and take notice. And then I smelled him. Pine and smoke and winter wind, and something ancient that bypassed my conscious mind entirely and went straight to the part of my brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey. The Alpha King had found me, and somewhere beneath the heat and the terror and the desperation, a horrible truth crystallized with perfect clarity. I was about to become another Clara, another cautionary tale, another Omega who thought she could escape biology, only to learn that nature always collects its debts. His shadow fell across me like nightfall, and I braced for hands that would take rather than ask. That's what alphas did. That's what I'd learned from Clara's screams and whispered warnings and every survival instinct I'd honed over 11 years of hiding. When an alpha found an omega in heat, especially an unclaimed omega whose scent was flooding the air with biological desperation, there was no negotiation. There was claiming, quick and brutal or slow and calculated, but always inevitable. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for it. The stone was cold against my cheek. I focused on that, the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and unreliable. My fingers were still curled against the floor, and I could feel the grit of centuries-old dust under my nails. Small details, concrete things. Something to anchor me while my body betrayed me, and the most powerful alpha in the kingdom decided what to do with his unexpected prize. The silence stretched. No hands, no commands. No weight pressing me further into the floor while he took what biology said was his right to claim. Just silence. And then, impossibly, the sound of fabric rustling, leather creaking, something heavy being set down on stone with a soft metallic ring that I couldn't identify through the haze of heat and terror clouding my senses. I kept my eyes closed. If I didn't look, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I'd passed out and this was some fever dream my oxygen-starved brain was constructing while my body shut down on the records hall floor. "Can you hear me?" His voice was nothing like I'd expected. The Alpha King's voice should have been a weapon sharp and commanding, the kind of tone that made wolves drop to their knees whether they wanted to or not. I'd heard him speak exactly once, from a distance, during a formal address to the palace staff. Even from 3 corridors away, his voice had carried the weight of dominance that made my wolf want to bare her throat. But this voice was soft, careful, like he was approaching a wounded animal and didn't want to spook it into doing something that would hurt worse. "I'm not going to touch you without permission," he continued, and that's when my confusion broke through the fear enough to make me crack one eye open. I saw his boots first, black leather, worn at the toes in a way that suggested actual use rather than ceremonial display. My gaze tracked up dark pants, a simple tunic, no crown, no formal regalia, nothing that screamed royalty, except the raw power rolling off him in waves that made my heat-addled body want to simultaneously run and submit. And he was kneeling. The Alpha King was on his knees on the records hall floor, close enough that I could see the details of his face, but far enough that there was space between us. Actual, deliberate space. His hands were visible, resting on his thighs, palms up in a gesture I recognized from wolf etiquette as non-threatening. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. He was younger than I'd thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of winter storms. There was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and another along his jawline that disappeared into the scruff he hadn't bothered to shave. His face was strong, angular, the kind of bone structure that would photograph well for official portraits. But there was something in his expression that portraits never captured. He looked sad, concerned, maybe even angry, but not at me. "My name is Daniel," he said, like that mattered, like I didn't already know exactly who he was. "And I need you to know that you're safe. Whatever you think is about to happen, it's not." My mouth was dry. When I tried to speak, only a pathetic whimper came out, and shame burned through me hot enough to compete with the heat still pulsing through my body. His jaw tightened. "Who taught you that your heat was a crime?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Nobody had ever asked me that. Nobody had ever suggested that the thing I'd spent 11 years running from might not be the monster I'd made it into. The herbs, the hiding, the careful construction of invisibility, all of it had been built on the fundamental belief that my heat was dangerous, that it would destroy me the way it had destroyed Clara. But he'd called it a crime. Not something I'd committed. Something committed against me. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up, and even if it hadn't, I wouldn't have known what to say. Daniel, and it felt wrong to think of the Alpha King by his first name. Like I was crossing some invisible boundary shifted slightly, lowering himself further until we were almost eye level. The movement should have been threatening, should have triggered every flight instinct I possessed. Instead, it felt like he was trying to make himself smaller, less intimidating, as if an alpha of his caliber could ever be less intimidating. "You're in heat," he said, matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. "A strong one from the scent of it. How long have you been suppressing?" I blinked at him, confusion cutting through the heat fog enough to form coherent thought. He wasn't supposed to ask questions. He was supposed to take. That was the entire reason I'd been hiding. "Answer me," he said. And there was the command I'd been expecting, but even that was gentler than it should have been. A request wearing the clothing of an order. "I need to know if you're in danger." 11 years, I whispered, the words scraping out of my throat like broken glass. Something flashed across his face, shock maybe, or fury. His hands curled into fists against his thighs before he deliberately relaxed them again. 11 years, he repeated, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "You've been poisoning yourself for 11 years to avoid this." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was something raw in his expression that made my chest ache. "Listen to me very carefully. What you're feeling right now, the heat, the need, all of it is natural. It's not wrong. It's not a punishment. It's your body trying to do what it was designed to do, and it's probably hitting you harder than it should because you've denied it for so long." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him about Clara, about the screams and the empty eyes and the way tradition was just a pretty word for ownership. Wanted to explain that natural didn't mean safe, and design didn't mean good, and I'd rather die than end up claimed by someone who saw me as property. But another wave of heat chose that moment to slam through me, and I gasped, my body curling in on itself as the pain-pleasure need of it stole my breath. "Easy," Daniel murmured, and I felt more than heard him shift closer. "I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me for just a moment." Trust. The word was almost funny. Trust the Alpha King, who could command me to submit and I'd have no choice but to obey. Trust the man whose scent was making my wolf practically purr even while my mind screamed danger. "I'm going to help you," he said, "but only if you let me. Do you understand? You have to give permission. Permission." When had an Alpha ever asked an Omega for permission? I stared at him, at this impossible man who'd knelt on stone floors and removed his crown and was speaking to me like I was a person instead of a biological imperative. Fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but something else was threading through it now. Something I didn't have a name for because I'd spent so long convinced it didn't exist. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, this didn't have to end the way I'd always thought it would. "Why?" I managed to ask. His expression softened. "Because you deserve better than what you've been taught to expect." And despite everything, the heat, the fear, the 11 years of carefully constructed defenses, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Something dangerously, terrifyingly close to hope. "I need to touch you," Daniel said. And even those words came wrapped in request rather than demand. "Just my hand on your shoulder. It will help ground you, give your wolf something to focus on besides the heat, but only if you say yes." My wolf was already reaching for him, straining against the edges of my consciousness like she'd been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. The rational part of me, the part that had kept me alive through 11 years of suppression, was screaming that this was a trap. That gentleness was just another way to lower your guard before the real violence started. But I was burning alive from the inside out, and he was offering me something that might make it stop hurting. And God help me, I was desperate enough to take the risk. "Yes," I whispered. His hand settled on my shoulder so carefully it might have been made of spun glass. The contact sent a shock through my system, not painful but intense enough to make me gasp. His touch was warm, steady, and the moment his skin connected with mine, something in my body recognized him. My wolf stopped her frantic clawing and went quiet, not in fear but in sudden, overwhelming focus. The heat didn't disappear, but it shifted, changed from a wildfire consuming everything in its path to something more contained, still intense, still demanding, but no longer quite so much like dying. "Breathe," Daniel murmured, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Let your body remember how to regulate." I tried. Drew in air that tasted like pine and smoke and something uniquely him, and felt my racing heartbeat slow by maybe 5 beats per minute. It wasn't much, but it was something. A lifeline thrown to someone drowning in their own biology. "Good," he said softly. "That's good. You're doing better than you think." I didn't feel like I was doing better. I felt like I was falling apart in slow motion while a stranger held the pieces together through sheer force of will. But his hand stayed steady on my shoulder, thumb moving in small circles against the fabric of my dress. And gradually, so gradually I almost didn't notice, the desperate edge of panic started to recede. "What?" I had to stop, swallow, try again. "What are you doing?" "Providing an anchor," he said. "Your wolf needs something stable to orient around. Without it, the heat just spirals. With it," he paused, considering. "With it, you have a choice about what happens next." Choice. There was that word again. I don't understand. And I didn't. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. Heats didn't come with choices. They came with biology so overwhelming it erased everything else, leaving only the imperative to mate, to claim, to complete the cycle that ensured pack survival. Daniel's hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck, still careful, still asking permission with every inch, and the relief was so immediate and profound, I nearly sobbed. The neck hold wasn't dominant or possessive. It was stabilizing, like he'd found the off switch to my body's panic response and pressed it. "The way you were taught about heats," he said quietly, "is wrong. Or at least incomplete. Yes, there's biology involved. Yes, there's drive and need and instinct. But there's also choice. Always choice. The problem is that most packs have forgotten that, or deliberately ignored it, because choice means power shifts away from alphas who benefit from claiming without consent." I blinked at him, my heat-fogged brain struggling to process what he was saying. "You're saying I don't have to?" "You don't have to do anything," he confirmed. "Not with me, not with any alpha. Your heat is yours, your body is yours, and anyone who tells you different is lying to maintain control." The words should have sounded idealistic, naive, the kind of thing someone might say in theory but never actually mean in practice. But Daniel's hand was steady on my neck, and his scent was wrapping around me like a blanket, and most damning of all, I believed him. "What if I can't?" The question came out smaller than I intended. What if the heat is too strong and I can't think clearly enough to choose? His thumb brushed against my pulse point, and my wolf practically purred. "Then we wait until you can. I've secured the records hall. No one is getting through that door. We have time. You just wait?" "I'd wait as long as you needed." He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like alpha kings regularly canceled their days to sit on stone floors with collapsed omegas who smelled like desperation and broken suppression magic. Another wave rolled through me, but this time, anchored by his touch, it didn't feel like dying. It felt like something I could survive. My body was still demanding, still insistent, but the sharp edges of panic had been filed down to something almost manageable. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "Why would you help me? You could just take what you want." His hand tightened slightly on my neck, not threatening, but firm, solid. "Because I don't want an omega who submits because her biology gives her no other choice. I want..." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. The pack deserves better than rulers who claim through force. You deserve better than an alpha who would use your vulnerability against you. For the first time in 11 years, maybe in my entire life, my body wasn't a battleground. It was still in heat, still flooding my system with hormones and need and all the biological imperatives I'd spent over a decade trying to suppress. But with Daniel's hand on my neck and his scent wrapping around me like armor, it wasn't a war I was losing. It was just something happening. Something I could observe and experience without being completely consumed by it. "I don't know your name," Daniel said, and there was something almost sheepish in his tone. "I've been in your scent for 10 minutes and I don't even know what to call you." Despite everything, the heat, the fear, the complete upheaval of everything I thought I knew, I felt my lips twitch. "You're the Alpha King, don't you have records?" "I have records on approximately 3,000 palace employees," he said dryly. "And I've been king for 8 months. I'm still learning names." 8 months. That explained why I didn't recognize him beyond reputation. The old king had died last spring, and I'd been too busy hiding to pay attention to the succession drama that had apparently brought Daniel to power. "Alara," I said finally. "My name is Alara." "Alara." He repeated it like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Turns out Alpha Kings can, in fact, ask nicely. Who knew? The comment was so unexpected, so deliberately light after the intensity of everything that had come before, that I actually laughed. It came out broken and slightly hysterical, but it was real. Daniel smiled, just a slight curve of his lips, but it transformed his whole face, made him look less like an untouchable monarch, and more like a man who'd knelt on stone floors to help someone he didn't know, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Better," he said softly. "Laughter helps too. Reminds your body that not everything has to be life or death." "Pretty sure this still qualifies as life or death," I pointed out, but some of the terror had leached out of my voice. "Maybe," he conceded, "but you're still here, still fighting, still choosing. That counts for something." His hand stayed on my neck, steady and sure, and for the first time since the heat had broken through my carefully maintained defenses, I thought I might actually survive this. Not just survive with my dignity intact, my autonomy preserved, my future still my own. All because an Alpha King had knelt instead of claimed, had asked instead of taken, had offered me choice when everything I'd been taught said I'd have none. The heat still pulsed through me, demanding and insistent. But Daniel's presence had given me something to push back against it with. Not suppression or denial or herbs that poisoned me slowly, but actual, genuine support, the kind that said I mattered beyond what my biology could provide. "What happens now?" I asked. Daniel's expression grew serious. "Now we help you through this, on your terms, at your pace. And then, when you're thinking clearly again, we have a very long conversation about why you felt you needed to suppress for 11 years, and what we're going to do to make sure no one else in this pack ever feels that desperate again." The future he was sketching, one where my heat wasn't the end of my autonomy, but just a thing that happened, manageable and survivable, seemed impossible. But his hand was real, his scent was real, and the way my body was starting to settle, finding equilibrium in his presence, was real. Maybe impossible was just another word for things I hadn't let myself imagine could be true. The heat lasted 3 days. 3 days where Daniel stayed with me in a private room he'd had prepared, not his chambers, which would have sent entirely the wrong message to a pack already buzzing with speculation, but a space in the medical wing where omegas and heat could be tended safely. He brought healers who spoke in soft voices and offered cool cloths and herbal teas that actually helped instead of poisoning me slowly. He stayed close enough to provide the anchor my wolf needed, but never crossed the lines I drew, even when my heat-addled brain wasn't entirely sure where those lines should be. On the 4th day, I woke up clear-headed for the first time in what felt like forever. My body ached, that deep, bruised feeling of muscles that had been clenched too tight for too long. But the fire was gone. The desperate need had receded. I could think in straight lines again, could remember who I was beyond biology and panic. Daniel was asleep in a chair by the window, his head tipped back against the wall at an angle that was going to give him a horrific crick in his neck. He'd stayed the whole time. The Alpha King had cleared his schedule, ignored what must have been dozens of urgent matters requiring his attention, and stayed with a nobody clerk from the records hall because he'd promised I wouldn't have to face this alone. I was staring at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd kneeled on stone floors with the crown I knew he wore, when the healer came in. Her name was Miriam, and she'd been kind throughout the heat, efficient but warm, clinical but never cold. She took one look at me sitting up in bed and smiled. "Welcome back," she said quietly, mindful of Daniel still sleeping. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got trampled by a herd of something large and angry," I admitted. "But better, clearer. That's normal." She moved to the bedside, pulling out supplies for what I assumed would be a routine post-heat examination. "Your body went through significant trauma. 11 years of suppression doesn't just disappear because you finally had a heat. We'll need to monitor you carefully for the next few weeks." I nodded, expecting her to check my pulse, maybe my temperature, the standard things healers did. Instead, she pulled out a small silver knife and a glass vial. I went very still. "What's that for?" "Blood sample," Miriam said, her tone matter of fact. "Standard protocol for any Omega whose heat presents unusually." "Unusually, how?" She paused, exchanging a glance with Daniel that I might have missed if I hadn't been watching her so closely. Except Daniel wasn't asleep anymore. His eyes were open, alert, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach drop. "The scent," Miriam said carefully. "During your heat, your scent had markers, specific pheromone signatures that we haven't seen in several generations." I blinked at her. "I don't understand." Daniel rose from his chair, moving to the foot of the bed where I could see him clearly. His hair was disheveled, his tunic wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept even less than I thought, but his gaze was sharp. "There are bloodlines in the pack," he said quietly. "Ancient lines that carry specific traits. Most of them have diluted over time, become so mixed with other lines that the original markers are barely detectable." He paused. "Yours aren't diluted." My heart started beating faster. "What are you saying?" Miriam held up the vial. "We need to confirm it, but if I'm reading the markers correctly, and I've been studying bloodline signatures for 30 years, so I'm fairly confident you carry the Moonfire line." The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head, looking between them. "I don't. I'm nobody. My mother was a seamstress. My father worked in the grain mills before he died. We're not some ancient bloodline. We're just—" "Low quarter," Daniel finished softly. "I know. I had your records pulled after the first day." He held up a hand before I could panic about privacy violations. "Not to invade, to understand. To make sure you had family I needed to notify, to check if there was anyone who might come looking for you. And your lineage goes back exactly 3 generations before it becomes mysteriously blank." His expression was grim. "No records, no family tree, nothing. Which is unusual for pack members, even low-ranking ones. We keep meticulous records, always have." "So what does that mean?" Miriam set the vial down, her expression grave. "It means someone deliberately erased your family history. And the Moonfire line is exactly the kind of bloodline powerful families might want to suppress." "Why?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "What's so special about Moonfire?" Daniel and Miriam exchanged another look, and this time I caught the weight of it, the kind of significant glance that preceded information someone really didn't want to share. "The Moonfire bloodline," Daniel said slowly, "produces Omegas with enhanced fertility, stronger heats, and most importantly, the ability to stabilize pack bonds. Historically, Moonfire Omegas were considered sacred. They could strengthen a pack's cohesion, improve territory boundaries, even influence the health of neighboring packs through their presence." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward until they touched everything I thought I knew about myself. "You're saying I'm— what? Valuable?" "Invaluable," Miriam corrected quietly. If the markers are confirmed, Moonfire Omegas were bred into royal lines deliberately for centuries, until about 150 years ago, when the last known Moonfire Omega was claimed by a rival pack and the bloodline was thought to have died out. I stared at her, at Daniel, at the vial that would apparently confirm whether I'd gone from invisible nobody to pack asset overnight. "I don't want this," I said. The words came out flat, but panic was building underneath. "I spent 11 years hiding. I can't. I won't be some breeding stock for powerful families." "You won't be." Daniel's voice cut through my rising panic with absolute certainty. "That's not how this pack operates. Not anymore. But if word gets out, it already has." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Your heat was strong enough that every alpha in the palace smelled it. They know something unusual happened. By now, the rumors will have spread through the pack. Elders are probably already circling, trying to figure out who you are and how they can use you to advance their family's positions." The room felt too small suddenly, too close. I'd spent 5 years perfecting invisibility, and now I was apparently the most visible person in the pack. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," I said, and I hated how my voice shook. "This is why I took the herbs, why I hid. Because the moment you become valuable to powerful people, you stop being a person and start being property." Daniel moved closer, careful not to crowd me, but close enough that I could see the determination in his eyes. "Listen to me. The Moonfire bloodline makes you powerful in your own right, not as someone's mate or breeding vessel, but as yourself. The old ways, the ways where Omegas were claimed and controlled, those are changing. I'm changing them, but I need time, and I need allies." "And you think I'm going to be an ally?" I laughed, but it was bitter. "I'm a clerk who spent 5 years hiding in a basement. What possible use could I be?" "You survived," he said simply. "For 11 years you survived in a system designed to break people like you. You're stronger than you think. And yes, if the bloodline is confirmed, you have power. Real power. The kind that could help reshape pack law, that could protect other Omegas from being forced into situations like the one you avoided." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I was nobody, nothing, just a girl who'd gotten good at disappearing. But Miriam was holding that vial, and Daniel was watching me with an expression that suggested he saw something I didn't. And underneath my panic, underneath my fear, there was something else stirring. Something that remembered Clara's empty eyes and thought maybe, just maybe, having power meant other girls wouldn't have to drink poison for 11 years just to stay free. "If we do the blood test," I said slowly, "and it confirms this Moonfire thing, what happens to me?" "That depends on you," Daniel said. "But I can promise you this. No one will claim you against your will. No one will force you into a bond you don't choose. And anyone who tries will answer to me." The Alpha King's promise, given in a medical room to a clerk he'd known for 4 days. It should have felt empty, performative, the kind of thing powerful people said and never meant. But I'd watched him kneel, watched him wait, watched him spend 3 days helping me through a heat that wasn't his responsibility, simply because it was the right thing to do. If there was any alpha in this pack I could trust with the truth of what I apparently carried in my blood, it was him. I held out my arm to Miriam. "Do the test," I said. The knife was sharp. The cut was quick. And as my blood filled the vial, I watched it catch the light and wondered if it really looked different, or if knowing what it might contain had changed how I saw it. Either way, I'd gone from invisible to invaluable overnight, and I had no idea if that was salvation or just a different kind of trap. The blood test took 6 hours to process. 6 hours where I sat in that medical room with Daniel, neither of us speaking much, both of us knowing that whatever came back in that vial would change everything. Miriam had sealed it with wax and carried it to the palace's bloodline specialist, an ancient wolf named Theron, who supposedly could read heritage in blood the way other people read books. I spent those 6 hours trying not to think about what it meant if the test came back positive, trying not to imagine the weight of a bloodline I'd never asked for, never wanted, settling onto shoulders that already felt too fragile to carry much more. Daniel spent them standing at the window, watching the courtyard below with an intensity that suggested he was seeing threats I couldn't. When Miriam finally returned, her face was grave. "It's confirmed," she said quietly. "Moonfire bloodline. Pure strain. Theron says he hasn't seen markers this strong in his entire lifetime." She paused. "He wants to know where you've been hiding." "Surviving," I said flatly. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The king has been informed. He's requested that you remain in these quarters for your safety while he consults with his council about next steps." My safety. That was a nice way of saying I was now too valuable to be allowed to wander freely. I'd traded one prison for another, even if this one had softer walls and a kinder warden. Daniel turned from the window. "How long before word spreads beyond the palace?" "It already has." Miriam's expression was apologetic. "Theron's assistant has family in 3 separate pack territories. By nightfall, every major family within 100 miles will know there's a Moonfire Omega in the capital." "Perfect," Daniel muttered. "How long until they start arriving?" "They're already here." The new voice came from the doorway, a guard I recognized from the palace rotations. His face flushed like he'd been running. "Your Majesty, there are emissaries at the main gate, from Silverpine territory. They're demanding an audience." Something cold settled in my stomach. Silverpine. That was where my mother's family had come from, before they'd moved to the capital lower quarter when I was barely old enough to remember. Before my father died and my mother remarried and we became a different family entirely, one that didn't talk about the past or where we'd come from. Daniel's expression went dangerously still. "Demanding?" "They have documents, sire. Legal claims. They're saying—" The guard hesitated, glancing at me with something like pity. "They're saying the Omega belongs to them." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Belongs to them. Not that I was from there, or connected to them, or had heritage there. Belongs. Like I was a misplaced piece of property they'd come to collect. "What kind of documents?" Daniel's voice had gone cold in a way that made my wolf want to bare her throat, even though his anger clearly wasn't directed at me. "Betrothal contract, signed by her mother 20 years ago. They claim she was promised to the Silverpine Alpha's son before her family fled the territory. They're demanding she fulfill the contract." The room tilted slightly. "Betrothal contract." My mother had never mentioned. But then, my mother had never mentioned a lot of things. Like why we'd left Silverpine. Like why she'd been so adamant that I keep my head down and never draw attention. Like why she'd looked relieved every year that passed without my heat arriving. She'd known. She'd known what I was, what I carried, and she'd done everything in her power to keep me hidden from exactly this. "Show me the documents," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The guard produced a leather folder, thick with papers that looked old enough to be legitimate. Daniel took them, scanning quickly, and with each page he read, his expression grew darker. "This is—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "This is a breeding contract, not a betrothal. They're not claiming you as a person, Alara. They're claiming you as bloodstock." The clinical nature of the word bloodstock made my stomach turn. Can they do that? Can a contract signed when I was 3 years old actually be enforceable? Under old pack law? Daniel's hands tightened on the papers. "Yes, especially if your mother took payment for the promise, which according to this, she did. 50 gold marks and safe passage out of Silverpine territory. 50 gold marks. The price my mother had accepted to promise her daughter's future to strangers. To sell me before I was old enough to understand what being sold meant. "I won't go," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I don't care what some piece of paper says. I won't go with them. You won't have to." Daniel's tone was absolute. "But we need to handle this carefully. Silverpine is a large territory, and their alpha is traditional. If we simply refuse to honor a legal contract without cause, it could be seen as an act of aggression. So what do? We meet with them. We hear their claim. And then we find a way to break this contract that doesn't start a territorial war." He looked up from the documents, his storm-gray eyes meeting mine. "But I need you to understand something. They're not going to accept a simple refusal. Silverpine's Alpha has been trying to rebuild his family's power base for years. A Moonfire Omega would give him exactly the leverage he needs. He will push. Hard. The guard cleared his throat. Sire, they're demanding the meeting happen within the hour. They say if you refuse, they'll file a formal complaint with the Continental Pack Council. The Continental Pack Council, the governing body that oversaw disputes between territories and enforced pack law across the region. If Silverpine took this to the council with a legitimate contract, things would get complicated fast. Daniel's expression was carved from granite. Tell them I'll meet with them in the throne room in 1 hour. And make sure Captain Marcus has guards posted at every entrance. I want this formal and witnessed. The guard bowed and left, leaving me alone with Daniel and the sudden, crushing weight of everything that had changed in less than a day. They called me property, I said quietly. I know. Daniel set the documents down like they disgusted him. And before this day is over, they're going to learn exactly what happens when someone tries to claim property in my territory. He paused, then added, if you'll let me fight for you. If I'd let him, still asking, still giving me choice even when the alternative was letting me be dragged away to a territory where I'd be nothing more than a breeding vessel for someone else's power. Why? The question burst out before I could stop it. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. I'm just some clerk who collapsed in your records hall. Why risk a territorial conflict over me? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd heard it since he'd kneeled on that stone floor. Because 8 months ago, I became king of a pack where Omegas suppress their heats for 11 years just to stay free, where little girls watch other little girls get claimed and learn that their bodies will betray them eventually, no matter how hard they hide, where mothers sell their daughters for 50 gold marks and safe passage. His hands curled into fists. I can't change the past, but I can damn well make sure that from this moment forward, no Omega in my territory is ever treated like property again. He turned to face me fully. So yes, Alara, I will fight for you. Because you deserve to be fought for. Because every Omega who's watching this situation deserves to see that things can be different. And because Silverpine's Alpha needs to learn that the old ways don't work here anymore. They called me property. Daniel called it war. And as I looked at this Alpha King who'd knelt instead of claimed, who'd asked instead of taken, who was willing to risk territorial conflict for a clerk he'd known for less than a week, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd found the one person in this entire pack who saw me as something more than the bloodline I carried. Then fight, I said. But I'm not hiding in this room while you do it. If they're coming to claim me, I'm going to be there to tell them exactly what I think of their contract. Daniel's expression shifted surprise, then something that might have been pride. You're sure? It won't be pleasant. I've survived 11 years of poison and 5 years of hiding and a heat that nearly broke me, I said. I can survive a meeting with some alphas who think they own me. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but was close. Then let's go teach Silverpine exactly how wrong they are. They came for me in the corridor between the medical wing and the throne room. We should have known it was too easy. Should have realized that Silverpine wouldn't just wait politely in the throne room for a meeting that might not go their way. But Daniel's guards were focused on the main entrances, on the official delegation that had announced itself at the gates with documents and demands. Nobody was watching for the 3 wolves who'd slipped through the servants' passages. I smelled them half a second before they struck unfamiliar scents, sharp with adrenaline and purpose. My wolf surged up in warning, but I didn't have time to shout before they were on us. The first attacker went for Daniel, which was their mistake. You don't survive to become Alpha King without being able to handle a surprise attack. Daniel moved like water turning to ice fluid, and then devastatingly hard. His hand caught the attacker's throat mid-lunge, and there was a sickening crack as he slammed the wolf into the stone wall hard enough to leave a crater. The second and third attackers ignored Daniel entirely. They came for me. I barely had time to register the knife silver, because of course it was silver, the one metal that could truly harm our kind, before hands grabbed my arms and someone's breath was hot against my ear, voice rough with command. Don't fight. The Alpha wants you intact. intact, like I was a package to be delivered undamaged. Something in me snapped. I'd spent 11 years swallowing poison to avoid this exact scenario. Spent 5 years perfecting invisibility. Spent 3 days surviving a heat that should have broken me. I hadn't done all of that just to be grabbed in a hallway by wolves who thought they could claim me because some contract said I was theirs. I didn't scream. I burned. The fire came from somewhere deep inside me, not literal flames, but heat that radiated outward from my core with enough force to make the wolves touching me jerk back in shock. My skin lit up with light that looked like moonfire, silver white and bright enough to cast shadows in the dimly lit corridor. The moonfire bloodline, awakening in response to threat. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't have training or control or any idea how to wield whatever power was suddenly pouring through me. But my wolf knew. She'd been waiting for this, had been pressed down by suppression herbs and fear for so long that when she finally rose, it was with 11 years of pent-up fury. The attackers stumbled back, shielding their eyes from light that shouldn't have been possible. One of them lunged again anyway, desperation overriding self-preservation, and that's when Daniel roared. The sound wasn't human, wasn't even wholly wolf. It was something primal and terrible, the kind of noise that resonated in your bones and made every instinct you possessed scream predator. But there was something wrong underneath it, something wild and uncontrolled that suggested Daniel was losing his grip on the careful restraint he usually maintained. Alpha Kings didn't lose control. They couldn't afford to. An Alpha King in full rage was a threat to everyone around them, friend and foe alike. I watched him tear into the remaining attackers with a violence that was both horrifying and efficient. Blood painted the walls. The scent of death and fear flooded the corridor, and underneath it all, I could feel Daniel's control fracturing, could sense his wolf rising with the kind of dominance that would flatten every wolf in the vicinity if it broke free completely, including me. The attackers were down dead or dying. It was hard to tell, but Daniel wasn't stopping. His eyes had gone completely gold, no trace of human consciousness visible, and his attention was swinging toward me with an intensity that made my newly awakened power flare in instinctive response. He didn't recognize me. In his rage, I was just another threat, another target. Daniel. My voice came out steady despite the terror coursing through me. Daniel, look at me. He snarled, taking a step toward me, and I could see the moment he decided I was enemy, could see the shift in his posture that preceded an attack. I should have run, should have used the moonfire still burning under my skin to defend myself, should have done anything except what I actually did, which was step forward into his space and press my hand against his chest. The moment we connected, the moonfire surged, not outward this time, but inward, flowing from me into him like water finding cracks in stone. I felt it spread through his system, cooling the rage, dampening the wild loss of control that had threatened to consume him entirely. The moonfire bloodline's gift, the thing that made us invaluable to packs, the ability to stabilize bonds, to anchor even the most dominant wolves when they threatened to lose themselves. I was anchoring him. Daniel's eyes flickered gold to gray and back again, consciousness fighting with instinct. His hand came up to cover mine where it pressed against his chest, not to remove it but to hold it there, like he was drowning and I was the only solid thing he could grab onto. Alara. My name came out rough, barely human. You need to. Run. Can't control. You can, I said firmly. You will, because I'm not running and you're not going to hurt me. How do you know? Because you kneeled. The words came from somewhere deep and certain. Because you asked. Because in 3 days you never once took what you could have claimed by right. You won't start now. The moonfire pulsed between us, and I felt the moment his wolf recognized it. Recognized me. Not as threat or prey or property, but as something else entirely. Something his wolf had been searching for without knowing it existed. Pack stabilizer. Bond anchor. The thing that made Moonfire Omegas sacred in the old days, not because we could breed strong wolves, but because we could save them from themselves. Daniel's eyes cleared gradually, the gold receding until I was looking at the man again instead of the monster his rage had nearly turned him into. His breathing was ragged, his hands shaking where they held mine against his chest, but he was present, in control. "You saved me," he said, wonder threading through the exhaustion in his voice. "You saved me first," I pointed out. "In the records hall. Seemed only fair to return the favor." He laughed, the sound broken and slightly hysterical. "Alara, you're glowing." "Did you know you're glowing?" I looked down at myself and realized he was right. My skin was still lit from within with that silver-white light, like I'd swallowed the moon and it was trying to shine its way out through my pores. "I don't know how to turn it off," I admitted. "Don't." His hand tightened over mine. "Not yet. Let the guards see it when they arrive. Let the whole damn palace see it. Let Silverpine's delegation see exactly what they tried to claim." Footsteps thundered toward us, guards responding to the commotion, too late to prevent the attack but in time to see the aftermath. They rounded the corner and stopped short, taking in the scene. 3 bodies on the ground, blood on the walls, their king covered in evidence of violence, and me glowing like a supernatural beacon in the center of it all. Captain Marcus, who I recognized from palace rotations, took one look and started barking orders. "Secure the corridor. Get the healers. Someone find out how in the name of the moon these wolves got past our perimeter." Daniel hadn't moved. His hand was still over mine, his heartbeat strong and steady under my palm, and I realized we were still connected, still anchored to each other through whatever bond the moonfire had created when I'd stopped him from losing himself completely. "They were going to take you," he said quietly, meant only for me. "They were going to drag you out of my territory, and I was going to let them because I thought following pack law mattered more than—" "Don't," I cut him off. "You were trying to prevent a war. That's not weakness. That's being a good king. A good king protects his people. You did. You are." I paused. "And I'm not your people. Not really. I'm just some clerk who—" "Your pack." His voice was absolute. "From the moment you stopped me from tearing apart this corridor and everyone in it, you became pack. My pack. And anyone who tries to take you will learn exactly what that means." The moonfire between us pulsed once more, and I felt something click into place. Not a bond we weren't mated, weren't claimed, but a connection that ran deeper than contracts or bloodlines or anything written on paper. I'd anchored him, he'd fought for me, and in the space between those two actions, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be easily undone. "The Silverpine delegation is still waiting," Captain Marcus said carefully. "What do you want me to tell them?" Daniel's smile was sharp enough to cut. "Tell them the meeting is canceled. Tell them their assassins failed. And tell them that if they ever set foot in my territory again, I'll consider it an act of war." He finally released my hand, and the moonfire dimmed but didn't disappear entirely. I had a feeling it wouldn't, not fully. Not now that it had been awakened. "Come on," Daniel said, offering me his arm like we were going to a formal dinner instead of standing in a blood-soaked corridor surrounded by bodies. "Let's go make sure the rest of the pack understands exactly what happens to people who think they can claim what's ours. Ours, not his. Ours." And despite everything, the attack, the blood, the power burning under my skin that I didn't know how to control, I took his arm and let him lead me forward into whatever came next. I didn't scream when they came for me. I burned. And in burning, I discovered exactly what the moonfire bloodline meant. Not weakness to be controlled, but power to be respected. They'd spent centuries trying to claim us, trying to own us, trying to turn our gift into their weapon. They'd forgotten that fire, even moonfire, has always belonged to itself. The throne room had never held this many witnesses. Every pack elder was there, summoned by emergency protocol, when word of the assassination attempt spread through the palace like wildfire. The Silverpine delegation, what remained of it after their assassins failed, stood in the center of the room flanked by guards, their expressions ranging from defiant to calculating. Members of the Continental Pack Council had arrived within hours, drawn by accusations serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. And then there was me. I stood beside Daniel's throne, still glowing faintly with moonfire I couldn't quite extinguish, wearing a simple dress that one of the palace Omegas had brought me because my own clothes were blood-stained and ruined. My hair was loose, unstyled, and I probably looked more like a wild thing than someone who belonged in a formal pack proceeding. I'd spent 11 years perfecting invisibility. Now I was the most visible person in the room. Daniel hadn't taken his throne yet. He stood in front of it, arms crossed, his presence filling the space in a way that made even the council representatives straighten their spines. The evidence of the corridor attack had been cleaned from his skin, but there was still blood on his clothes, a deliberate choice, I realized. A reminder of exactly what Silverpine had tried to do. "This emergency council is called to order," announced Elder Margrave, the most senior pack elder present. Her voice was steady, despite the tension crackling through the room. "We are here to address serious accusations made by Alpha King Daniel against the Silverpine delegation, specifically regarding an attempted kidnapping and assassination on palace grounds. The lead Silverpine representative, a man named Silas with silver streaking his dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd never seen anything worth smiling about, stepped forward. "Accusations we categorically deny," he said smoothly. "The wolves in question were not part of our official delegation. If they entered the palace, they did so without our knowledge or sanction. We came here in good faith to reclaim property that legally belongs to Silverpine territory under a binding contract. I am not property." My voice cut through his statement like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt the weight of their attention, some curious, some disapproving, many simply shocked that an Omega had spoken without being addressed first. In traditional pack hierarchy, Omegas didn't interrupt Alphas during formal proceedings. We waited to be called upon. We answered questions when asked. We certainly didn't contradict territorial representatives in front of the Continental Pack Council. I was done with traditional pack hierarchy. "I am not property," I repeated, stepping forward even though my legs were shaking. "And I am not bound by a contract my mother signed when I was 3 years old without my knowledge or consent." Silas's expression hardened. "Pack law states." Pack law was written by Alphas who benefited from treating Omegas like assets to be traded. I interrupted again. "But I'm standing here now, and I'm telling you directly, I will never set foot in Silverpine territory. I will never fulfill that contract. And any attempt to enforce it is slavery dressed up in legal language." The room erupted into murmurs. Elders exchanged glances. The council representatives leaned together, whispering urgently. Silas's face had gone an alarming shade of red. "You don't have the authority to break a legal contract," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You're an Omega. You don't get to decide. She gets to decide everything about her own life." Daniel's voice cut through the noise like thunder. "And if Silverpine's position is that she doesn't, then Silverpine can explain to the Continental Pack Council why they believe contracts that treat sentient beings as commodities should still be enforceable in modern pack law." One of the council representatives, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who'd been watching the proceedings with intense focus, stood. "Alpha King Daniel raises a valid point. The contract in question was drafted under laws that are contentious. Several territories have moved away from enforcing such agreements. Several territories have gone soft," Silas snapped. "The old ways exist for a reason. Order, structure. Bloodlines maintained and strengthened through strategic bonding. Without these contracts, packs descend into chaos. Or into freedom," I said quietly, but my voice carried in the sudden silence. "Which probably looks like chaos to people who profit from control." Silas turned on me, and for a moment I saw pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you're special because you carry Moonfire blood? You're a genetic accident that should have been claimed generations ago. Your mother understood that. She took our gold and promised you to us because she knew that's all Omegas. Like you are good for producing strong heirs for powerful families." The moonfire under my skin flared in response to his words, bright enough that several people in the room shielded their eyes. "My mother," I said, and my voice shook but held, "took your gold because she was desperate. Because she was fleeing a territory that would have used her the same way you wanted to use me. She made a choice under duress, with no real options, And you call that a binding agreement? I took another step forward, and guards tensed but didn't move to stop me. I've read the contract. I know what it says. Delivered intact at first heat for breeding purposes. Not marriage, not bonding, breeding, like I'm livestock. That's what you are. Silas's mask had slipped completely. A valuable bloodline in an unremarkable vessel. Without an alpha to guide you, to use your gifts properly, you're wasted potential. Silverpine would have given you purpose, status, a place in a powerful family. Silverpine would have given me a cage. The words came from somewhere deep and certain. And I've already spent 11 years in one of my own making. I'm not trading it for yours. Elder Margrave cleared her throat. The Omega's testimony is noted. However, the question remains whether her personal feelings about the contract override its legal standing. They do. Daniel moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Because Alara is a citizen of this territory, under my protection, and I'm invoking sovereign immunity. Silverpine has no jurisdiction here, and their contract signed under duress, involving a minor who couldn't consent, and explicitly treating a person as breeding stock is void under the reforms I enacted 3 months ago. Silas laughed, sharp and bitter. Reforms that the Continental Pack Council hasn't ratified. Reforms that most traditional territories consider radical and dangerous. You can't just rewrite centuries of pack law because you've decided to be progressive. Watch me, Daniel said flatly. The council representative who'd spoken earlier stood again. Alpha King Daniel, your reforms are still under review. Until they're ratified, existing contracts must be honored. However, she paused, choosing her words carefully. The attempted kidnapping changes the context significantly. If Silverpine was involved in planning or executing an attack on your territory, that constitutes an act of aggression that would void any standing agreements. We weren't involved, Silas insisted. Then explain, Daniel said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, why 2 of the 3 attackers had Silverpine territory marks tattooed on their shoulders. Why their weapons were silver forged in the Silverpine smithies we had them analyzed. Why one of them was carrying a transport authorization signed by your Alpha, dated for today, for 1 Moonfire Omega, secured. The room went deadly silent. Silas's face went from red to white. Those documents could have been forged. They could have been, Daniel agreed. But they weren't. We've had them verified. So either your Alpha sent assassins to kidnap an Omega from my territory while you distracted us with legal proceedings, or your security is so incompetent that someone forged official documents and deployed your wolves without anyone noticing. He smiled, cold and sharp. Either way, Silverpine has violated territorial sovereignty. The contract is void, and you have exactly 60 seconds to leave my territory before I have you arrested for conspiracy. The council will hear about this. The council is hearing about it right now, the female representative said dryly. And speaking personally, what I'm hearing is that Silverpine attempted to circumvent diplomatic channels through violence. That tends to make us unsympathetic to your legal claims. Silas looked around the room, searching for support and finding none. The other elders were watching with expressions ranging from disapproval to barely concealed satisfaction. Nobody wanted to align themselves with a territory caught red-handed in an assassination attempt. This isn't over, Silas said finally, directing the words at me. Moonfire bloodlines are too valuable to waste on misguided independence. One way or another, you'll fulfill your purpose. My purpose, I said clearly, is whatever I decide it is. Not what you decide, not what some contract says, not what my bloodline demands. Mine. I was done surviving quietly, done hiding, done letting other people write the story of who I was supposed to be. The moonfire blazed bright enough that the throne room looked like it was lit by a second sun, and I didn't try to dim it. Let them see. Let them all see what they'd tried to claim, tried to own, tried to reduce to genetic potential and breeding capacity. Let them see what happened when an Omega decided she was done being property. Silas and his delegation left under guard escort, their threats hanging in the air like smoke. The council representatives withdrew to deliberate, their faces troubled. The elders dispersed, already forming the alliances and counter-alliances that would define how this situation played out in pack politics. And I stood in the center of the throne room, glowing like a beacon, with Daniel beside me and the weight of visibility pressing down on my shoulders like a crown I'd never asked for. But I'd chosen it anyway. Chosen to speak, chosen to fight, chosen to be seen. And maybe that choice would cost me. Maybe Silverpine would find other ways to come for me. Maybe the Continental Pack Council would side with tradition over progress. Maybe I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next threat. But I'd do it as myself, fully visible, fully present, fully alive. Not as property, not as bloodstock, not as someone else's purpose. Just as Alara, Omega, Moonfire, free. The Continental Pack Council took 3 days to render their judgment. 3 days where I stayed in the palace under heavy guard, not because Daniel thought I'd run, but because intelligence reports suggested Silverpine wasn't done trying. 3 days where documents were analyzed, witnesses were interviewed, and the full scope of what Silverpine had been doing for decades slowly came into horrifying focus. Because once the council started digging into that assassination attempt, they found everything else. I'd thought my situation was isolated. One contract, one desperate mother, one Omega they wanted to claim. But the investigators found 47 similar contracts spanning the last 60 years. 47 Omegas promised to Silverpine before they were old enough to understand what was being signed away. Some had been collected when their heats arrived. Others had disappeared entirely. Their families paid off or threatened into silence. 3 of those Omegas were found in Silverpine territory during the investigation, kept in what the official report delicately called secured breeding facilities. The unofficial report, the one Daniel showed me in private, called them what they actually were: prisons. Nothing terrifies corrupt men quite like documented evidence. The council chambers were packed when the judgment was finally read. I sat in the gallery between Daniel and Miriam, my hands clenched so tight in my lap that my knuckles had gone white. Down below, Silas and the rest of the Silverpine delegation stood in a line, their earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like barely contained panic. Council head Seraphine, the gray-haired woman who'd questioned the contract's validity, stood at the central podium. Her expression was carved from granite. After extensive investigation into the events of 5 days ago, she began, her voice carrying through the chamber with perfect clarity. This council has reached several conclusions. First, regarding the attack on Alpha King Daniel's territory, we find conclusive evidence that 3 Silverpine wolves, acting under orders from Alpha Marcus of Silverpine, entered the capital territory with intent to kidnap Omega Alara against her will. This constitutes an act of territorial aggression under Continental Pack Law, Article 7. Silas's face had gone gray. Beside him, the other Silverpine representatives looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Second, Seraphine continued, our investigation uncovered a pattern of coercive contracts targeting Omegas with valuable bloodlines, signed under duress and enforced through threats, violence, and systematic suppression of information about Omega rights. These practices violate the Omega Protection Accords established in 1889 and updated in 1967. My breath caught. The Omega Protection Accords had been taught to me as mostly symbolic pretty words on paper that nobody actually enforced. But Seraphine was reading them out like they mattered, like they had teeth. Third, we discovered evidence of unlawful detention of multiple Omegas in facilities that can only be described as imprisonment. These individuals were held against their will, denied freedom of movement, and treated as, she paused, disgust flickering across her face, as breeding stock rather than sentient pack members with full rights under pack law. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Even people who'd known Silverpine was traditional hadn't expected this. Contracts were one thing, lots of packs still used them. But actual imprisonment? Breeding facilities? That crossed lines most modern packs had abandoned decades ago. Therefore, Seraphine said, raising her voice to cut through the noise, this council renders the following judgment. All contracts signed by Silverpine Territory regarding Omega bonding or breeding are declared null and void. Alpha Marcus of Silverpine is hereby stripped of his territorial authority and will face criminal prosecution for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit violence across territorial boundaries. Silas made a sound like he'd been punched. One of the other delegates actually sat down heavily, his legs giving out. Furthermore, Seraphine continued, relentless, Silverpine Territory is placed under council supervision for a period of no less than 5 years. All detained Omegas will be released immediately and provided sanctuary in territories of their choosing. Any Silverpine wolves who wish to leave the territory will be granted safe passage and protection. She paused, letting the weight of the judgment settle over the room. This council recognizes that these practices, while most egregious in Silverpine, are not unique to that territory. We are therefore opening a comprehensive review of Omega rights and protections across all Continental Pact territories. Alpha King Daniel's proposed reforms will be given full consideration, and territories will have 6 months to demonstrate compliance with updated standards or face sanctions. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. I didn't know what I'd expected. Maybe a slap on the wrist for Silverpine. Maybe my contract voided but nothing else changing. Maybe Daniel fighting a lonely battle for reforms that would take decades to implement. But this was the entire system being forced to look at what it had allowed to happen in the shadows. This was accountability on a scale I hadn't dared to imagine. There will be no war, Seraphine said, her gaze sweeping across the chamber. Because war would suggest 2 legitimate sides in conflict. What we uncovered in Silverpine was not tradition or cultural difference. It was systematic abuse disguised as pack law, and this council will not legitimize abuse by treating it as a matter worthy of armed conflict. Beside me, Daniel let out a breath he'd been holding. His hand found mine under cover of the gallery railing, squeezing once relief and vindication and something that felt like hope. The detained Omegas are being transported to safe locations as we speak, Seraphine continued. Medical and psychological support will be provided. Those who wish to testify against their captors will be given full protection. Those who wish privacy will have it. But make no mistake. Her voice hardened. Anyone who attempts to interfere with their recovery or freedom will answer to this council personally. Silas finally found his voice. You're destroying an entire territory over the complaints of ungrateful Omegas who were holding criminals accountable. Seraphine cut him off. There's a difference. One you'll have ample time to contemplate during your trial. Guards moved forward to escort the Silverpine delegation out. Silas fought against them briefly, his face twisted with impotent rage, but they dragged him away, still protesting about tradition and order and the death of pack values. The chamber slowly emptied as people processed what they'd just witnessed. I sat frozen, Daniel's hand still wrapped around mine, trying to understand that this was real. That speaking up being seen had started a cascade that toppled an entire territory's corrupt leadership. You're shaking, Daniel said quietly. I know. My voice came out thin. I thought I'd be alone in this. Fighting for myself with maybe you backing me up if I was lucky. I didn't think that other Omegas were fighting too, Miriam said from my other side. That your case would give them permission to come forward? That the council would actually listen? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Truth has a way of spreading once someone's brave enough to speak it first, Daniel said. You did that. In the throne room. You chose to be seen, and that choice gave 47 other Omegas the courage to be seen too. 47. The number settled into my chest like a stone. 47 lives that might have been destroyed if I'd stayed quiet. If I'd let them take me. If I'd accepted that my purpose was whatever the powerful decided it should be. What happens to them now? I asked. The ones they found? Sanctuary, Daniel said firmly. Here, if they want it. Or in any territory willing to take them, and I have a feeling there will be many. This judgment just made protecting rescued Omegas politically popular. His mouth quirked. Nothing motivates pack politics like being on the right side of a council ruling. Cynical, I said, but I was almost smiling. Accurate, he corrected. But I'll take it. However it happens, those Omegas get to choose their own futures. That's what matters. Seraphine approached our gallery seats, her expression softening slightly. Omega Ilara, I wanted to thank you personally. Your testimony was instrumental. I just told the truth, I said. Yes, but truth requires courage when speaking. It puts you at risk. She glanced at Daniel. You have an unusual Alpha King, it seems, one who actually listens when Omegas speak. I'm learning, Daniel said dryly. Slowly, with significant correction when I get it wrong. Seraphine's lips twitched. Continue learning. The reforms you've proposed, they're good, better than good, but they'll require constant vigilance to implement. Powers that have gone unchecked for centuries don't surrender quietly. I noticed, Daniel said, gesturing toward where the Silverpine delegation had been dragged out, but they do surrender eventually, especially when the alternative is documented evidence of their crimes spread across every pack territory on the continent. Nothing terrifies corrupt men quite like documentation, Seraphine agreed. Use that. And, she looked at me directly, use voices like hers. Omegas who can speak to what the system actually does, not what it pretends to do. That's your most powerful weapon. She left, and the chamber was finally empty except for us, and a handful of guards maintaining protocol. I leaned back in my seat, exhausted and exhilarated, and still trying to process that we'd won. Not through war, not through violence or political maneuvering or anything I'd expected, but through truth, through evidence, through choosing to be seen when being invisible would have been so much safer. So, Daniel said eventually, what do you want to do now? It was such a simple question, so ordinary, but it hit me that nobody had asked me that in maybe ever. What did I want? Not what did my bloodline demand, or what did pack law require, or what would keep me safest. Just what did I want? I thought about the records hall, dusty and silent and safe, about 11 years of poison drunk to stay invisible, about Clara's empty eyes and my mother's desperate bargain, about 47 Omegas who'd been locked away because powerful people decided their purposes for them. I want to help, I said finally. The Omegas they found, the ones being released, they're going to need someone who understands, who's been afraid, who knows what it's like to think your only choices are submission or suppression. I looked at Daniel. If your reforms are going to work, you need Omegas helping to implement them, not just Alphas deciding what's best for us. His smile was slow and genuine. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Were you? You anchored me when I lost control. You spoke truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You literally glow with power you're still learning to use. He stood, offering me his hand. Ilara, you were never going to go back to filing ledgers in a basement. I think we both know that. I took his hand and let him pull me to my feet. The moonfire flickered under my skin, gentler now but still present, still mine. So what am I then, if not a clerk? Daniel's expression grew serious. Whatever you choose to be, that's the whole point. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. The palace gardens were quiet at twilight, the kind of peaceful that only comes when the day's chaos has finally exhausted itself and evening settles in like a held breath. I'd been living in the palace for 2 weeks since the council's judgment, not in the servants' quarters anymore, but in actual guest chambers with windows that overlooked the rose gardens and furniture that didn't creak when you sat on it. Daniel had offered me a permanent position, Omega Advocate, he called it, a newly created role that would help implement the reforms and support Omegas transitioning out of situations like Silverpine. I'd accepted, not because I owed him, but because the work mattered, because 47 freed Omegas needed someone who understood what they'd survived, because pack law was being rewritten in real time, and I'd be damned if it got rewritten without Omega voices at the table. But tonight, I wasn't thinking about work or politics or bloodlines. Tonight, I was thinking about the Alpha King sitting on a stone bench 20 feet away, pretending to read correspondence by lamplight while very obviously waiting for me to finish my walk through the gardens. We'd been dancing around each other for 2 weeks, Ever since the moment in the corridor where I'd anchored him and the moonfire had bound us in ways neither of us fully understood. We'd been professional, appropriate, careful to maintain boundaries that would let me build a life here, without anyone assuming I was trading one form of ownership for another. But the tension was getting ridiculous. I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking at him, could sense his presence in rooms before I saw him. My wolf recognized his in ways that had nothing to do with hierarchy or dominance, and everything to do with something deeper, something that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, and I was tired of pretending I didn't feel it. I walked over to his bench, close enough that he had to look up from his correspondence. His eyes met mine, and something in them made my breath catch. Not possession or demand, just want. Raw and honest and tinged with uncertainty that an alpha king shouldn't have been able to show. "You're terrible at pretending to read," I said. His lips quirked. "You're terrible at pretending to take peaceful evening walks when you've circled this garden 4 times in the last hour. Maybe I'm trying to decide something. And have you?" He set the papers aside, giving me his full attention. "Decided?" I sat down beside him, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The moonfire flickered gently under my skin, responding to his nearness the way it always did now. Not desperate or overwhelming like during my heat, but steady, grounding, right. "I've been thinking," I said slowly, "about choice, about how you gave it to me when nobody else would, how you kneeled instead of claimed, how you asked instead of took." I turned to face him fully. "And I've been thinking about how I spent 11 years convinced that wanting an alpha meant losing myself, that any bond would be a chain." Daniel's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled into loose fists against his thighs like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for me. "But that's not what this is," I continued. "What we have. It's not ownership or biology or some predetermined path my bloodline carved out for me. It's just us. The way you see me, the way I see you. The fact that when your wolf was about to tear me apart, mine reached out and said, 'Not this one is ours.' Alara." My name came out rough, like it hurt to say. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," I interrupted. "That's the entire point. I'm not choosing you because pack law says I should, or because my heat made the decision for me, or because I'm grateful you saved me. I'm choosing you because when I imagine my future helping the freed Omegas, changing pack law, building something better, you're in it. Not as my alpha or my king, just as Daniel, the man who kneeled." His control broke. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a gentleness that made my chest ache. "I've wanted to hear you say that since the moment you stopped glowing long enough for me to think clearly. But I was terrified that asking would make you feel obligated, that you'd say yes because of what I am instead of who I am. I spent 11 years hiding from what you are," I said honestly. "Alphas, kings, power, all of it terrified me. But then you kneeled and you asked, and you made me believe that maybe power could be wielded differently, that maybe choosing an alpha didn't mean losing myself." I leaned into his touch. "You're not my owner, Daniel. You're not my master or my superior or the one who gets to decide my purpose. You're just the man I want to build a life with." "Equal," he said softly, and it wasn't a question. "Equal," I confirmed. "Partner, whatever you want to call it, but not possession, never possession." His other hand came up to frame my face, and he rested his forehead against mine. This close, I could feel his heartbeat syncing with mine, could smell pine and smoke and something uniquely him that made my wolf practically purr with contentment. "I love you," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. "Not because you're moonfire, not because you're powerful, not because anchoring me was the most incredible thing anyone's ever done for me, though it was. I love you because you're brave and stubborn and you challenge me to be better than the king I thought I had to be. Because you chose to be seen when being invisible would have been safer. Because even terrified and in heat, you looked at me and demanded dignity." My eyes burned with tears I hadn't expected. "I love you too. even though loving an alpha king is possibly the worst decision I could make for maintaining my hard-won independence. He laughed, the sound breaking some of the intensity between us. We'll figure out how to make it work. Set boundaries. Make sure your role is separate from any bond we form. Ensure everyone knows you're here because you choose to be. Not because... I kissed him, just leaned forward and pressed my lips to his, cutting off the anxious planning with action. He froze for half a heartbeat, surprised, and then he was kissing me back with a fervor that suggested he'd been holding back for 2 weeks and was done pretending. His hand slid into my hair, my fingers curled into his shirt. The moonfire blazed bright enough that the garden lit up like daylight for a moment before settling into a warm glow that wrapped around both of us. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel's eyes had gone slightly gold around the edges. "So," he said, voice rough, "does this mean you're accepting my completely informal, not at all politically motivated? Absolutely. Just because I'm hopelessly in love with you courtship?" "Courtship?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling this?" "I'm trying to be traditional," he said, slightly defensive. "Respectable. To prove I'm not just claiming you because I can." "Daniel." I waited until he met my eyes. "I know you're not claiming me. You've spent 2 weeks bending over backwards to make sure I know that. But here's the thing, I want to be claimed by you. Not in the ownership sense. In the you're mine and I'm yours and we choose each other sense. The way it's supposed to work when 2 people decide they want to build a life together." His expression shifted, something heated and possessive flickering through before he visibly tamped it down. "You're sure? Because once we formalize this, once we bond, people will have opinions. They'll say you're just another Omega who got pulled into an Alpha's orbit. They'll question whether you really have autonomy or if you're just playing a part I've assigned you." "Let them question," I said. I spent 11 years afraid of exactly that. Afraid that wanting an alpha meant losing myself. But I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know the difference between choosing to be with someone and being owned by them. And I'm choosing you. "Equal partners," he said again, like he needed to hear it confirmed. "Equal partners," I agreed, "who happen to be a very powerful Alpha King and a very glowy Omega with a bloodline that makes people nervous. We'll figure out the politics. We'll set boundaries. We'll make sure everyone knows I'm not your possession." I smiled. "And then we'll be together anyway, because that's what we both want." Daniel pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, strong and steady, and underneath it, his wolf reaching for mine with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "I'm going to court you properly," he murmured against my hair. "Dates, conversations. Time to be sure this is what you want. And then, when you're absolutely certain, I'm going to ask you to bond with me. Formally, publicly, in a way that makes it clear to everyone that you chose this, that you chose me." "I already chose you," I pointed out. "I know, but I want to earn that choice every single day. Want to prove that an Alpha and an Omega can build something based on respect and partnership instead of biology and hierarchy." He pulled back enough to look at me. "Want to show every Omega who's watching that this us is possible. That choosing love doesn't mean surrendering freedom." And there it was. The reason this worked. The reason I could stand here in the arms of the most powerful Alpha in the territory and feel completely, genuinely safe. Because he understood that what we built together had to be stronger than tradition or bloodlines or biological imperatives. It had to be choice. Every single day. Chosen and rechosen, and built on a foundation of mutual respect that refused to let either of us be diminished by the other. "Then court me," I said. "Take me on dates. Have conversations. Prove to both of us that this works outside of crisis and political drama." I kissed him again, softer this time. "And then ask me to bond with you, and I'll say yes. Because you kneeled, Daniel. You asked. And you gave me back my power when everyone else wanted to take it away." We sat in the garden as twilight deepened into night, wrapped around each other, making plans for a future that looked nothing like what either of us had imagined. I wasn't his omega in the traditional sense, possession or property or biological imperative fulfilled. I was his equal, his partner, his choice, just as he was mine. And for the first time in my life, love felt like freedom instead of a cage. The moonfire glowed softly between us, binding without constraining, connecting without controlling. Proof that even the most powerful forces, bloodlines, biology, destiny, could be transformed when filtered through choice. When two people decided that partnership mattered more than power. That love without chains was the only kind worth having. 6 months later, I stood in front of 43 Omegas in a meeting hall Daniel had converted from an old armory. 43. Not 47. 4 had chosen to leave the territory entirely, to build lives far away from anything that reminded them of what they'd survived. I didn't blame them. Healing looked different for everyone, and sometimes it required distance that mere miles couldn't measure. But these 43 had stayed, had decided that the best revenge against a system that had tried to break them was to dismantle that system from the inside. We called ourselves the Omega Council, which sounded far more official than we actually were. Mostly we were a collection of traumatized wolves trying to figure out how to transform personal pain into structural change. Some days we succeeded brilliantly. Other days we argued for 3 hours about meeting schedules and accomplished nothing except giving each other headaches. Today was shaping up to be one of the good days. The Continental Pack Council ratified the final reforms this morning, I announced, and the room erupted into cheers loud enough that guards probably heard it 3 corridors away. Every territory now has to maintain an Omega advocacy office. Suppression herbs are regulated. You need actual medical justification to access them long-term. Not just, I'm afraid of my heat. And any contract involving an Omega requires that Omega's signature after they turn 18, with a mandatory review by an independent advocate. What about the breeding facilities? Asked Tessa, one of the Silver Pine survivors. She was small and fierce, with scars on her wrists from restraints and a spine made of pure steel. Are they actually shutting them down or just calling them something prettier? Shut down, I confirmed. The council's been conducting surprise inspections across territories for the last 4 months. They've found and closed 6 more facilities we didn't even know existed. The Omegas from those facilities are being relocated and given the same support structure we built here. Tessa's shoulders dropped with relief. Around the room, I saw similar reactions, tension releasing, hope flickering to life in faces that had learned not to trust good news. So we actually did it, said Marcus, one of only 3 male Omegas in our group. We actually changed pack law. We started changing it, I corrected. This is the framework, but implementation is going to take years, probably decades. There are territories that will resist, that will find loopholes, that will do the minimum required and call it progress. Sounds like we'll be busy for a while, Tessa said, and she was smiling. The meeting continued for another hour. Logistics, upcoming testimony before regional pack councils, support programs for Omegas still emerging from bad situations. When we finally adjourned, I was exhausted in the way that comes from work that matters, that leaves you drained but satisfied. I found Daniel in his office, buried under correspondence and looking slightly panicked. How was the meeting? He asked, glancing up with the expression of someone who both wanted to know and was terrified of the answer. Productive. We're planning a territorial tour to help other areas implement the advocacy offices. Tessa wants to lead it. Of course she does, Daniel muttered. That woman terrifies half my council. She terrifies most of your council, I corrected, settling into the chair across from his desk. Turns out, survivors of breeding facilities have very little patience for politicians who want to move slowly on reforms. I've noticed. He set down the paper he'd been reading. The council sent another request for you to testify at the Continental Summit next month. They want your perspective on long-term suppression effects. I'd been expecting this. My story, 11 years of herbs, the violent heat that had finally broken through, the moonfire awakening had become something of a case study in why the old ways needed to change. Some days I resented being a symbol. Most days I accepted it as the price of the platform I'd been given. I'll go, I said. But I want Tessa and Marcus with me. This can't just be the Moonfire Omega telling her special story. It needs to be multiple voices showing this was systemic. Already arranged, Daniel said, and his expression softened. You don't have to ask permission, you know. For any of this. The advocacy work, the council, the tours, it's yours. I'm not your supervisor. I know, but you're my partner, and I like keeping you informed of my plans. I smiled. Especially when those plans involve traveling across the continent with Omegas, who make your political allies nervous. They make me nervous, he admitted. Your council meetings sound more intense than my war strategy sessions. That's because your war strategy sessions are theoretical. Our meetings are about preventing actual ongoing harm to actual living people. Tends to raise the stakes a bit. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I'd learned to recognize over the past 6 months. The look that said he was seeing not just what I was, but what I'd become. The transformation from invisible clerk to someone who regularly made territorial alphas uncomfortable with pointed questions about their Omega policies. You're scarier than I am now, he said. You know that, right? I laughed. I'm really not. You are. I can command obedience, but you command respect. That's infinitely more dangerous to people who rely on the old systems. He stood, moving around the desk to lean against it in front of me. And I love watching it. Watching you own the power you tried so hard to suppress. Watching you turn trauma into advocacy. Watching you prove that Moonfire Omegas were sacred not because we could be claimed, but because you could change entire pack structures just by refusing to accept how things had always been. His hand found mine, fingers interlacing in the casual intimacy we'd built over months of actual courtship. Dates where we talked about everything except politics. Quiet evenings in the gardens. Moments of normalcy stolen between his duties as king and mine as the face of Omega reform. We hadn't bonded yet. That had been deliberate my choice, supported by Daniel even though I could tell his wolf was getting impatient. I needed time to build my role independent of him. Needed the territories to see me as the Omega advocate first, the Alpha King's partner second. Needed to prove to myself that what we had was strong enough to survive without the biological imperative of a bond pushing us together. But we were getting close. I could feel it. The rightness of it settling into place like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their proper configuration. I've been thinking, Daniel said carefully, in the tone that meant he'd been planning this conversation and was nervous about my reaction. Dangerous activity for an Alpha King. He smiled briefly, but his expression stayed serious. About bonding. About what that looks like for us, given that we're apparently accidentally revolutionizing pack structure and everyone's watching. My heart rate picked up. And I don't want to do it the traditional way. I don't want some ceremony where I claim you in front of witnesses and you submit to my authority, and we perform the same rituals that have been used to legitimize ownership for centuries. He squeezed my hand. I want something different, something that represents what we actually are to each other, which is partners, equals, two people who choose each other without hierarchy or dominance or any of the biological imperatives everyone assumes drive Alpha-Omega bonds. He pulled me to my feet, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. I want a bonding ceremony where we both make vows, where the language is about partnership and choice and building something together rather than one of us belonging to the other, where the bite, if we even do the traditional bite, means I choose you, instead of I own you. The moonfire flickered to life under my skin, responding to his words and his proximity and the weight of what he was offering. Not just a bond, but a redefinition of what bonding meant. You want to rewrite the bonding ceremony the way we rewrote pack law, I said. I want to prove that even the most sacred traditions can evolve when the people participating in them demand better. His hands came up to frame my face. And I want every Omega who watches us bond to see that there's another way. That love and partnership can exist without domination. That choosing an alpha doesn't mean losing yourself. I thought about Clara. About the screams disguised as celebration. About the 11 years I'd spent convinced that any bond would be a cage. About the 43 Omegas downstairs who were learning to trust again after everything that had been done to them in tradition's name. Yes, I said simply. Daniel blinked. Yes? Just like that? You don't want time to think about it, or... I've been thinking about it for months, I interrupted. Watching you support my work even when it makes your political life complicated. Watching you defer to my expertise on Omega issues even though you're the king. Watching you prove every single day that partnership isn't just pretty words you say to make me feel better. It's how you actually operate. I rose on my toes to kiss him softly. So yes, let's bond. Let's do it our way. And let's show everyone watching that the future of pack structure looks nothing like its past. His control broke, and he kissed me hard enough that the moonfire blazed bright, flooding the office with silver-white light. I could feel his wolf rising to meet mine, not in dominance but in recognition, in the bone-deep certainty that this was right, that we were right, that what we were building together was stronger than tradition or biology or any force that had tried to determine our paths before we'd even met. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel was smiling. The council is going to hate this, he said. The council can deal with it. I straightened his collar, which had gotten rumpled during the kissing. Besides, half of them are terrified of me anyway. Might as well give them something real to be concerned about. My revolutionary Omega, he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Your equal partner who happens to be leading a structural overhaul of pack law, I corrected. That too. We spent the evening planning not just the bonding ceremony, but everything that came after. The continued advocacy work, the territorial tours, the slow, grinding process of ensuring reforms weren't just words on paper but actual changes that protected Omegas who couldn't protect themselves. And in between the planning there were moments of simple domesticity that I'd never imagined having. Daniel reading correspondence while I drafted testimony, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to summon dinner from the kitchens, his hand finding mine across the desk, just to maintain contact while we worked. This was the after, the part that came when the crisis ended and the dramatic rescues were done and what remained was just life, building something together, choosing each other not just once in a grand gesture, but every day in 1,000 small ways. I'd spent 11 years hiding from my biology, convinced that being seen would destroy me. Turns out, being seen really, fully seen was what had saved me. And what we built from that visibility was transforming not just my life but the lives of every Omega who came after, who would grow up in a world where suppression wasn't survival, and heats weren't sentences, and choosing an alpha didn't mean surrendering your power. The moonfire glowed softly in the evening light, constant now, a reminder of what I carried, but also of what I'd become. Not property, not bloodstock, not even just the moonfire Omega who'd changed pack law. Just Alara, partner, advocate, beloved, chosen and choosing, every single day. Free. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Tina Romance Library. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.